I really enjoy the research process, the reporting, talking to the scientists, reading scientific literature and learning new things. And then, encapsulating it is the writing aspect. I like learning new things, and I have a background in science, and I chose not to stay a scientist because I realized that I like to be more of a generalist than a specialist. And so I like to learn about a wide variety of research. And science itself is so specialized and so labor-intensive and slow, so incremental, that if you're actually doing it, not a lot happens. I mean, it's kind of monotonous there in the lab. What I get to do in my job is I get to call up these people that have just spent 5 or 10 years of their lives slaving away on the bench, and they've just gotten this exciting finding, and they tell me about it. So, I come in and I cherry pick. And I get to call up all these smart people, and they tell me what they've done, and then I get to write it into a story form that's, accessible, interesting, accurate, and entertaining. I am a big picture person, an idea person, and so I really like the concepts. What I don't like is the production aspect, because it's just minutia. It's what size font should you use, and should there be an extra space here, and should you have an apostrophe here? I just don't care for that, and I'm glad that there are people in the world who are copy editors. And I also like imagery. A lot of people I know that are writers just like the words, just like the text. And I really like being able to be involved in obtaining images to accompany my stories. And that's unusual because most magazines and newspaper people just deal with the text. But I do, for most of my projects, the whole package. I've worked with illustrators to get them to draw illustrations to accompany a story that I've written. I've obtained photographs. I've taken and published photographs of my own. And so I really like that aspect too. I'm a very visual thinker. So often when I'm writing a story, I'm thinking about the images, and sometimes even think about the layout, although that's a little different now that the web has come along. For your students, they should definitely be thinking both print and online. Some of them might even be living in an only online world. And publications differ in whether their online presence is just sort of identical to their print presence and whether it's different. And I would say that more are different than are the same as print, because we know from various research that people read differently on the web. They like things to be shorter, their eyes skim around more, they like to have multiple points of entry. So instead of having one long flowing narrative, they like all these little bite-sized text boxes and lots of pictures. It's much easier now. It's much easier because everything's on the web. And I work at the National Institutes of Health that has a free online subscription to hundreds, possibly thousands of journals. And so I find that I rarely go to the library. I rarely have to use the Xerox machine. When I was in college, I remember taking bound publications to the Xerox machine and Xeroxing them and writing on the bottom and on the top of the pages, the name of the publication, because some of them hadn't figured out yet that they needed to include that so people would know the source. And you can save money and you can save trees because you don't have to print out or Xerox the whole article. You can copy and paste the little chunks that you want. I do a lot of research on the web, and it's important, obviously, to find sites that are reputable. So if right now I'm writing a story on pharmaceuticals based on natural products, things that are in nature. For example, digitalis, the heart medicine, is from foxglove, and aspirin is from willow, and there's a lot of examples of medicines that we have now. Penicillin is from mold that came from natural products. And so I would want sites that were, like the FDA or scientific journal sites. I wouldn't necessarily go to some site that was like, kind of holistic healing, mystical, I would try to go for, in my bias, in the world that I live in, Western science that has controlled experiments is considered more reputable. If it's a printed publication, or at least a publication that I've printed off the web, I'll highlight, I'll underline, and then I'll, write little notes to myself. If it's directly from online, I will sometimes copy direct chunks and put them onto a separate document, put them in a certain color font, so I know that that is the words of someone else, and then I'll rewrite it in my own words in black font so I know, I'm not plagiarizing. Because you can collect a lot of information, and sometimes you frankly forget what you've written and what you've just read. Some stories just seem to flow and write themselves. Other times I will literally copy and paste chunks in the different Lego pieces and see if the flow works, and if it doesn't, I'll just move around whole paragraphs. And sometimes these are very, very rough. I was taught that the best way to write efficiently is just to write, even though it's gobbledygook and you have a shitty, not my word, first draft, and then you edit. And you should spend at least 50% of the time editing, enough, as much or more time editing, self-editing, as you do writing. So most of the time I hold to that, and I'll just throw stuff in there that's really rough to try to get a basic structure, and then I'll smooth it out with transitions, and then I'll do a word count if I have a specific word limit, which I often do.
And students do.
Yeah, and then I'll trim here and there. And it's obviously easier to trim than it is to add new material. So I try to do most of my research up front. In my case, most of the time when I talk to sources, scientists typically, they're happy to talk to me because they know that I'm not an investigative reporter or a muckraker, that I'm going to write a fairly positive story about them, and that I'm on their side, and that my institution gives them money. Although I have no control over grants, and they know that. But at least it's not an adversarial relationship.
And that would be for students too, so that would be good for them to hear.
Okay. And so they're happy to talk to me, and most of them are very, very nice, and they like to talk about their research. But it is important to set up a time ahead of time. And most researchers I find are best, most easily accessible by email. So I usually start with email. There's a few exceptions that I've had to call. After a few days they don't answer my email. I think, maybe he's on travel, or maybe she's just more oriented to the phone. But most of the time email is quite successful. And then, like I said, I like to have a list of questions ahead of time, whether or not I provide that to them. I'll ask them, I always ask them to explain their research, even if I understand it, because that gets me to find out how they talk, what they think is important, the type of language that they use. I'll sometimes ask them to come up with an analogy or a metaphor if it's particularly difficult or technical to understand. And if they can't do that on their own, I might come up with one myself and say, would it be fair to say that, this is like taking apart a car, or, whatever the analogy would be, and check that with them. I will ask them to, I try not to say, how did it feel when you made this discovery, because that's kind of a psychobabble question, but I'll try to take them back to when they made the discovery. That's often the reason for my call, and get them to answer the question by asking it in a different way. So, tell me about the time that you realized, this important finding, or, was this surprise? Were you surprised or unexpected? Was this unexpected? And sometimes if they don't give me what I'm looking for, then I'll sort of reverse prompt them by saying like, oh, well, that must have been really exciting. And then they'll launch off and say, yeah, and yada, yada, yada. You try to establish some excitement for them if it's not natural. And then always when I end an interview, I say, is there anything else you want to tell me? As you did. And that is often where I get my best stuff. That could even launch a whole new angle or a whole new line of questioning or a great quote. So that is something to remember as well. And I'll also ask them, may I follow up with you? Are you going to be in town in the next 2 weeks or whatever the time period is? How's the best way to reach you? Do you have any colleagues that can speak about your work? Or if I'm doing a profile, you know, can I speak with any of your students or people that know your personality and work style as well as your work? I've talked to spouses, I've talked to people that have hired my subject, I've talked to students, co-workers, you know, things like that. In my initial email with them, I'll ask for, you know, what books or magazines or journal articles typically should I read so that I can better understand your research. And then I'll try to read those before I talk to the researcher. And occasionally, the interview process will bring out different aspects, and he or she will say, oh, and to learn more about that, you know, go to this source. And it hadn't occurred to him or her to tell me about it beforehand because it wasn't clear that my interview would go in that direction. Another thing that I like to ask that often gives important information is to ask if they're going to be attending any conferences soon, or if they're at which they're going to present information, or if they're working on any other papers. And you know, many times they'll say, yeah, we're going to prepare to submit a paper in a few months. And then I would ask, can you let me know when you've had it accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal? Because they can't really talk too much about it before it's been accepted, but after it's been accepted, and if I promise to adhere to the embargo, which of course I would as a professional, then I have a little bit more time to work on writing it between when it's been accepted and when it's published. Now the trick there is, because of the web, many publications are put on the web within days or even hours of when they're accepted. This sort of advanced online publication, it's sometimes called, or ASAP publication. And that makes it very difficult to time your writing for when the embargo lifts, especially if you have to have it cleared by a number of people, which in my case is true. You know, I have to have the scientists read it for accuracy, and then my editor, and the scientific in-house people that cover that field, and our director, and universities will also have that kind of a process. For a newspaper person, it's usually much faster. And it's also good to ask about funding. That's not the case for me because I am the funder and I know the funding, but for a straight journalist person or for a freelancer, it would be important to find that out to see if there's any conflict of interest or problematic areas. Like if you're doing research on a particularly promising drug or a drug that's being compared to another one, you want to make sure which pharmaceutical companies are funding it. Or if you're doing research on, you know, nutrition, it would be very interesting if, say, Pepsi-Cola were funding it. Journalists typically, when they're talking to someone, the agreement is, for at least people that are familiar with the press, that everything they say is on the record and can be quoted. Now, you know, it's nice if people aren't familiar with working with the press, that you're a little bit more flexible and generous with that. You know, if they say something and then all of a sudden say, oh, but don't quote me. If they're familiar with the press, like they're a White House press secretary or something, that doesn't fly. But if they're a scientist or someone that isn't, you know, be nice, be a human being, and say, okay, well, can you phrase that in another way? Or is there something about that topic that I can quote? Try to work with them. There's two types of wording that you also should be familiar with. One is on background, and the other is off the record. So when you agree with someone to talk on background, or that a certain part of your interview is on background, and often it's important to establish that up front, and then when you're done with that section, say, okay, now, you know, can the rest of this be on the record? On background means it's something that you can allude to, possibly even quote, depending on the publication, but you can't use the person's name. Surely you've read articles that said, you know, quote, the US is going to be invaded by Mars tomorrow, said an unnamed source. And that, yeah, or someone who prefers to be unnamed, or, you know, a high-ranking official that prefers to remain anonymous. Off the record is even more tight-lipped. You can't really even allude to it in the story. It's just something to file away in your own head as you're writing the story, as you're thinking about it, that provides context and nuance. Now what you can do is you can try to get somebody else to say it. You know, you can talk to another source and say, I've heard that, ... You know, what do you think about that? Or can you confirm that? Or, and you might have to talk to several people before you can get someone that'll say what you want to on the record. And again, especially with on and off the record, it's very important for the source to say, okay, now, you know, I'm going to tell you something, but I want it off the record. And then the person says that, and then, you know, you say, okay, now we're back on the record, right?